Welcome to Why So, the podcast where some of your favorite sewing personalities and rising stars share what motivates them to create using needle and thread. I'm your host, Jason Prater, and with me today is Mary Fons of Quiltfolk. I'm super excited to get to speak with her about why she sews. So welcome to Why I Sew, Mary.
Thanks, Jason. It's awesome to talk to some sulky folks. I haven't seen you in a little while, but I'm really fond of sulky. You all have been so kind to me. Some of the first awesome people that I met in the industry, Eric, and I just good vibes with sulky. You guys are.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I was a spring chicken coming in, and anybody who was like, "Hey, welcome," I was like, "Oh."
No, it just seems like forever ago too, right? I can't even, I'm just trying to think about how far back that goes.
It's like 2009, 2010, right in there is when I started being on Love of Quilting more. And then Quilty happened in 2010. So
that's crazy.
Yeah.
Man, I'm getting old.
I know. Same.
Well, your last name is sort of synonymous with quilting, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself for the listeners that don't know you, perhaps.
Sure. Well, I'm Mary Fons' kid, a 42-year-old kid at this point. But so I grew up, around quilts, and I'm a second generation quilter because my neither grandmother made quilts, but my mom, in the 1970s, the quilt revival happened, and it's kind of like what, it's called the Great American Quilt Revival because it's not really totally the case, but quilting during World War II and in the 50s, quilting wasn't as prominent as it was in the first 30 years of the 20th century. It was just kind of people were into polyester and things, and women were at work, and so they weren't sewing during the World War II. Anyway, so in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, there was this quilt revival. Anyway, my mom, was a mom of one and then three little girls. She was living in Iowa with my dad. And, around the time of the bicentennial, people were really excited to make quilts. It was a thing. And Mom was one of those people who wanted to do it. And she took a class in Winterset, Iowa, where I'm from. It's a small town in Iowa, John Wayne's birthplace. And she walked in.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. And the bridges in Madison County. That's my county. Yeah. And so she took a class through the extension office, some university, maybe in Ames or something. But she walked in, and Liz Porter was there too. And when Mom and Liz, got to know each other, quilting was just really hot. And they both had, English degrees in English, and they were pretty good at sewing, and people wanted to learn more. And so Mom and Liz started to teach classes, and a lot of times they were just one step ahead, of their students. I know the feeling, but they built a business, and a lot of women did. It was an amazing time for, independent businesses. Georgia Bonesteel, a working mother, started the first television show on public television about how to make quilts. She's amazing. And Eleanor Burns. And so you have all these really interesting, women, mostly, not all of them, building these businesses around quilting. And the industry, as you and I know it, it did not exist before the 1980s. But Mom and Liz were two really prominent figures in that industry. They started Love of Quilting magazine, which at its height was 350,000 circulations, huge. And then the television show, Love of Quilting, on public television. So I grew up around all this stuff. I know, right? And books and patterns and notions, all this stuff. So the empire, right? The quilting empire, right? So, but I didn't make quilts until I was 28 because it was
not until 28.
Yeah.
I was just talking with somebody else that started pretty late too. Yeah. That's interesting.
It was what Mom did for work, Jason. It was, it was she was always under a deadline, or she was traveling, teaching, all over the country. And so Hannah and Rebecca, my sisters, I'm the middle daughter, we were doing other creative stuff. I'm a writer first and foremost. I've always been writing poems and plays, and I have a master's degree in writing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And so we were doing other creative stuff. But when I was 28, I had a really bad year. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis at a really, I know, it was really, really gnarly. It was a very late stage, and I had a bunch of surgeries, and they all went really badly. I mean, it was like my complications had complications. I was young and I had just been married, like within a few months of walking down the aisle, this stuff all happened. So the marriage fell apart. It was way too much. We shouldn't have been married in the first place. And I was super sick and it was just a terrible time. And that's when I had like what I call my quilt epiphany, where I kind of like, it was like, I realized that when life is a mess, when it's like torn into a million pieces, it's really nice to like tear up perfectly good fabric into a million pieces and sew it back together again, in like a really nice
great
way.
Analogy. I love that.
It was like that. And so that's how I started. And I feel like people come to quilting if they come later in life, like that person you were talking to. And in my case, and if you come to quilt making when you're 60 or old or whatever, people kind of come through like, they take a path of like joy because they're making a baby quilt or they're doing a graduation quilt or something, or they come because they're going through something painful, a grief or something like that. So I was kind of I needed healing, you could say. It's kind of
was your mom encouraging that? And was she sort of your primary teacher or did you look elsewhere for that?
I'm self-taught, which is totally weird. But right around the time I started making quilts, because I never learned, I just never did with my mom. And right around this time I started having an interest in quilt making, Mom and Liz sold the business. They were ready to get out. And so when the new owners of the Fons and Porter brand, this big corporate faceless,
I remember that. I remember the time well. Yeah, we were big advertisers at the time.
True.
So yeah.
It's true. Well, they were really worried about Fons and Porter, leaving Fons and Porter. And so they heard I was interested in quilts now. And it was like, Fons, maybe Fons 2.0, like maybe. And I say this, it sounds pretty bitter and I'm not, but it's really true. I mean, they totally used me to keep my mom on TV for a while because Mom was super excited and it was super fun to work with her. And so they put me on the TV show, but I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I really didn't. I learned how to make quilts on national television. That is a literal fact. And it was so fantastic. Hard. I know it was terrible. It was so hard, but what's cool is, and some people hated it. I mean, they were so like, I can't learn from this person. Mary waves her arms too much. Like, this is terrible. It was like I replaced somebody on a soap opera,
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
But if you watch the show, and I was on for like 5 years and then of course I did Quilty, and you see the evolution of a quilter. Like if you could watch it on like fast speed, it's awesome. And so some people were like, Mary asks, dumb questions. I'm too advanced for this. And then other people would write in or put on Facebook that they love the show now because Mary asks dumb questions. And I have those questions too. So I was like, oh, you're welcome.
So you're literally learning how to quilt while teaching how to quilt on television. Wow. I love that.
Yeah, it was interesting.
So, I mean, what was like the first thing you made? I mean, was your first memory of starting to quilt literally like in the studio or did you start that prior to that?
I started it prior. Like I got a couple, it's nice when you're like part of the quilting mafia, I joke about that. Like when I was like, Mom, I want to make a quilt. It was like FedExed, overnight, some notions. So I have like a rotary cutter, a mat, like immediately. There are benefits, but I jumped in, and it's interesting. The modern quilters, that whole movement and genre and all those people in the community. I've never been a modern quilter. I like scrap quilts. If it's scrappy, I'm happy. Like I need lots and lots and lots and lots of fabrics. And so the solid color thing, I made one solid color quilt and I was like, this is not my thing.
And you're the right demographic for that.
Totally.
Just not your deal. Yeah.
No, it just wasn't my aesthetic or something. But what's cool is that they began, like they sort of hatched at the same time I did. So as the modern quilt guild has grown and like had its dramas and its growth and its whatever, I feel like this kinship toward them because it's like, yeah, I get it. Like we both started at the same time. But the reason I mention it is because the first quilt that I made, first couple quilts, there was cool fabric out, like Amy Butler, I was like, okay, maybe I'm into Amy Butler. And so I got some fabric from a friend who had a bunch of scraps. I had these notions and I just jumped in. And I learned how to make a half square triangle with my mom's like special ruler. And I was so excited. So I made a quilt of all half square triangles. I mean, I just kept making them and it was, it's a cool quilt, but pretty
soon. You still have it?
Yeah. I don't have a lot of them, but I have that one because it's kind of special. Awesome. But then pretty soon, I was at Iowa Public Television and learning on camera. And the one thing, like I did a lot of things done a lot of things wrong in my life, but the thing that I did right that made the show work was that I didn't pretend to know anything I didn't. I wasn't like, oh yes, and then you sew this to that. And, I wasn't fed lines. So learning how to do it on TV was not pleasant in many ways. Like I looked at Facebook once, literally one time. I was like, okay, well, that's crushing my soul. I'm not going to look at the comments. But like, I was like, so why do you do that, Mom? Like, what's the difference between this and this? And so because I didn't pretend or fake knowing what I was doing, it was actually ultimately I was learning,
Yeah,
and so,
very authentic that way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Super cool.
The first quilt I made, by the way, the very first one I made on my own, this is terrible. I haven't said this in public. I didn't know you had to press the pieces. So
I love that though, right? I mean, so many people, so many others probably don't know that or didn't know that too. So, there's always going to be that group of people that are 2 steps ahead of the teacher, and they're looking for the thing that you're doing wrong. Yeah. We know those kinds. They exist everywhere.
Oh, yes. The police.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously you identify primarily as a quilter, but do you sew other things as well?
No, I don't. I don't sew other things. I'm trying to think if I ever have. I haven't. My other passion, or it's the quilt history, which I've been doing a lot of, which I'd love to talk about at some point. But yeah, the quilt making is my only thing, and I'm into applique hardcore right now instead of piecing. But
okay,
yeah.
Cool. So now you have a new magazine, right? Or maybe it's not new, but you're doing something different now called Quiltfolk. Tell us about that. Well,
Quiltfolk, I'm editorial advisor now. I was editor-in-chief of Quiltfolk for 4 years. But to do other projects that I'm working on right now, they're super cool, all quilt related. I stepped down in April to just be editorial advisor for the magazine, because making the magazine, it's just like, it's such a huge job, and especially with Quiltfolk. So Quiltfolk was started in 2016 by Mike McCormick. He's out in Portland, Oregon. And Mike is a very interesting guy. He's like my brother from another mother. I love Mike, an amazing guy. He found the quilt industry because he was selling Stella lights. You probably know that company or remember that company. Yeah. So he and his friend were kind of behind that, or they were working with that. So, years ago, he came to Quilt Market, with this light, and he was like, oh my God, like a lot of people who don't know what our world is like, they come in and they're like, okay, like I had no idea.
I had no idea this big world exists.
Exactly. And he saw that and was so inspired by it. And he had dreams long ago of like being a documentary filmmaker. He actually played minor league baseball, just this interesting person. And he was like, he looked at the magazine situation, right? And by this time I had left Fons and Porter. I was in grad school and I was like doing my own thing and studying quilt history and things, but not working in the industry so much, guesting on the show sometimes, but that's right. So Mike looked at the publishing landscape in quilts in the quilt world. And he was like, where are the stories? Like there's how to, and there's like patterns, but that's it. And he was absolutely right. I mean, Quilter's Newsletter, you probably remember Quilter's Newsletter.
Yes.
Like back in the day, Quilter's Newsletter, I mean, it's the first magazine that was made for quilters. Bonnie Lehman started it at her kitchen table in like 1968 or something. And there was so much good content in that magazine. There was, history stuff. There was, people were writing articles, sending them in. There was like analysis. It was great. And over the years, it just became, and it's closed now because the company that owned it just completely ran it into the ground. It's a tragedy.
Yeah,
so there were there were no magazines that had what really this whole thing is about, which is connection and just stories and people. Like people make quilts. So Mike's like, there ought to be a magazine that doesn't have ads, because ads are often, just not that attractive. I mean, they serve their purpose, but they're not, artful, whatever. And he's like, really beautiful photography needs to exist for the people who make these quilts. He's like, I'm going to start a magazine. I'm going to call it Quiltfolk. It's going to be thick, like perfect bound, like 164 pages, no ads. And we'll go state by state quarterly. It's a quarterly magazine. And he's like, we'll go state by state and investigate and give profiles of the quilters in that state, and there's, I think, 12 feature articles in every magazine, more when I was editor, because I just couldn't say no to like really great stories. So I'd pack them in, much to the distress of everyone who was working with me.
I love that.
Yeah. And the photographs are absolutely gorgeous. If you've seen Quiltfolk, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful magazine. And so I became editorial I think it was something I clawed my way up the corporate ladder, I say, like within an issue or two to be editor in chief. And it's just been the most wonderful thing. I mean, Quiltfolk matters and it's inclusive. It's the styles of quilts that we look at are dynamic. And, we went to Kentucky and we were planning the issue and I was like, I need horses. Like we got to have a horse story, a horse quilt person story. Find me like a horse,
There's gotta be some of those in Kentucky, right?
Oh yeah. And we found this woman. She was amazing. We hung quilts on the barn and we actually have a quilt on a horse, which I was really happy about. But this beautiful landscape in Kentucky and her story and her husband and where they live and the quilts that she makes. We went to Nevada and I was like, we got to find a showgirl there because everyone quilts. There's always, I would find like the landscape or the state and look at that and then find the quilts within it because there are quilters from sea to shining sea. We know that rich, poor, every race, color, creed, everybody makes quilts. And so we could find amazing stories wherever we went. And the magazine is producing right now the Maryland issue 21, I think, 22. Yeah.
So in that role, are you sewing much yourself or is it just primarily writing and all of this sort of investigative kind of work where you're trying to find these cool stories? Yeah,
it's there are no patterns in Quiltfolk. I didn't mention that. No patterns. It's just stories. And this photography. So I'm helping find stories in the different states at this point and doing a lot of writing. I used to, because we travel there. I mean, we obviously go there. And so for years I was, helping to produce the trips and I was on location doing style shoot, the styling and everything. So, So
how has the pandemic impacted that?
God, I mean, when everything happened, we did Nevada and I got back on March 12th or something. I mean, it was happening. It was all descending in 2020. Yeah. And we got back and Mike and I got on the phone and I was like, what are we going to do? We're a travel magazine. And we can't travel, we're about people and we can't, be with people. And it was all so terrifying. And so we put our heads together and I was like, well, why don't we have to do something that we could do again because who knows how long this is going to last. Right. So I was like, instead of focusing on a state, why don't we focus on a theme? Like a theme that is present in quilt making. And so it's like, okay, there's charity, family, friendship, love, marriage, and so it was like, yeah, that could work. And so we did issue 16 is family, the family issue. And we solicited writing from our readership. And we don't do that usually. We write our stuff in-house. And what was amazing is we got incredible stories, hundreds of them from people who had all these stories to tell. And so we picked a huge lineup of them and ran stories from our readers of family and quilts. And every, story had a very specific family connection. And it was awesome to see the stories that came in because these were our readers and they were just amazing people, from every part of the country doing every style of quilts. It was awesome.
That's super cool. I love the words that you used there for your themes. It just so fits the industry as a whole, right?
Totally.
It's just,
absolutely.
I was on a podcast with another guest, and we were talking about that very thing. Just how full of good people, both within the industry and the participants and hobbyists. There's just something different about that segment of people in our society, right? I can't necessarily put my finger on it, but they just seem to be the best people out there.
I mean, I agree. I'm sure, the insurance industry is full of lovely people as well. And every industry has community and all that. But at the heart of what we do, we are making things that are really special. I mean, quilts are really unusual objects. It's like, I call them priceless, worthless objects. It's like they are, how much can you sell most quilts for in the marketplace? Very little. I mean, they don't sell. When I tell people, that I'm in the quilt industry, most people think I sell quilts. And it's like very few people these days are selling quilts. And so if you tried to sell a quilt on the market, you just wouldn't get much for it. But in your family, if this is a very important quilt in your family, you couldn't put a price on it. So
priceless.
It's priceless. It's priceless worth. It's really interesting. And it's a creative outlet and it's history, specifically, women's history of disenfranchised people, whatever. It's like all of these things. And that's what's at the core of what we do. And it's like, we got some pretty cool people because to be attracted to that you got to be kind of awesome. That's what I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got a huge king size quilt of my favorite team, LSU, hanging on the wall in my office here that awesome. Joyce, one of our owners, had made for me.
That's awesome.
You can't put a price on this thing. I mean, the hours that went into making it, exactly. It's got like little tiger paws as the quilt pattern, and little jersey, squares. Awesome. I mean, using LSU fabric. So it's priceless. And at home, I've got an old quilt of my grandmother made, just a, patchwork from scrap junky fabric and the whole thing is not really, it's hand tacked actually. So it's not really quilted per se. It's just tacked with yarn. And I mean, that thing is so old, but I love that thing. I sit in my chair with that. That thing is great.
I love a tacked quilt or a tied quilt. I mean, we love our long armors. We love our domestic machine quilters and our beautiful, machine quilting thread from, Sulky. And we love all this. But when you tie a quilt, it really is, it's interesting. If you really, really, really quilt a quilt hardcore on a machine, it's not that warm, right? Because it's, but with a tied quilt, you have that heat gets trapped in the quilt more easily because you have these tufts, these places. It's just it's fluffier, right?
And I never even thought about that, but you're right.
It's true. I love tied quilts, and I was like, why do I love them so much? And I was like, oh, they're cozier.
Yeah, the one that I have, my grandmother made, is very much that way, and it is now that I think about it, it is quite warm. But the batting she used literally was made. Not made. It was a blanket from a time when my grandfather was in the hospital, suffering from burns. Like he had 70% of his body burnt, and these were the blankets that they took back out of the hospital because they were saving everything. And that was the batting that she used in this thing.
That's crazy. That's crazy? So awesome. That's so awesome. I saw talk about priceless, right? Yeah. I saw a quilt a woman showed me out in the back of her car. I was at a gig years ago, and she showed me a quilt her mother had made in the Great Depression, and newspaper was the batting. Newspaper was the batting in that quilt. Yeah, for real. I was like, wow, that was all they had.
I'm sure you've made your share of gifts, right? And you just said things like that are priceless. And I know a lot of people don't really understand or sometimes don't appreciate that unless they kind of know somebody who does this and know the amount of time it takes. But does anything stick out in your mind, particularly a gift that you've made for somebody that holds special meaning?
Okay. Yes, I have a funny story. I mean, this is the first thing that comes to mind, which is ridiculous. I mean, I've made quilts of valor, which are so special, to give to. I love that organization. It's so good. And so that's probably what I should lead with, right? But what jumped into my mind immediately is, oh my God. So I'm married now, love of my life, like met him, we got married 4 months later, it'll be 3 years, and I just love him more every day. So that's great. But before I met him, I dated, I was a bachelorette, in Chicago, and it was great. And one of the guys I dated was he was a stock trader who he had, all these, cars and like all this, and it was like really fun, to date him and whatever. But he, oh God, I don't want to speak disparagingly about him, but he was an odd duck. Okay. He was kind of an odd duck. Like,
we won't say his name. You can talk about him all you want.
Yeah, exactly. So he was kind of strange, but he went to law school, and I maintain I got him into law school because I really helped him with his letter, and I don't know. It was a strange thing anyway. But the point is, he would go to law school classes. And when I say he was odd, he really was. I had given him a quilt. In fact, I gave him a quilt, my quilt called Emeralds, which was the only quilt I ever had on the cover of Fons and Porter's Love of Quilting magazine. And I didn't even know it was going to be on the cover. I got the magazine one day. I was like, oh my God. So this is like, wow. But I gave him that quilt before that was featured on the cover. Because, he loved it. And I was like, so he told me later that when he went to his classes at law school, this was after we broke up, he would take the quilt into class and wrap up in it.
That had to be a sight.
I mean, dude, it was Northwestern Law School. I was like, dude, you can't do that. Like, that's so strange. So that's a gift I gave. It was just so weird.
What a funny story. That's awesome. I could just see this guy huddled up in his law class with his quilt wrapped around him.
I was like, if it's cold in there, like, you can wear a sweater. It was a very strange thing, but
So when you broke up, did he keep his quilt?
Yes. I was I couldn't ask for it back, but man, that's like, it was a pretty good one. It was a pretty good quilt. So
oh my God.
Yeah, I didn't ask for it back. Once you give them, you never know. You never know what people are going to do with them. Yeah.
Well, I know that, certainly the Fons and Porter name has been attached to all sorts of sewing products and pattern, magazines, the whole 9 yards. But in terms of products, what are some of your favorite things, notions, nifty gadgets, stuff like that? What's something that you've been on your radar lately?
Well, I'd say when I was with Fons and Porter, for a long time, I used only Fons and Porter products, and I didn't ever think about it. But when my husband and I are in Chicago now, but we've been spending a lot of time in London for his job, and so I was at the Birmingham Festival of Quilts in Manchester.
Oh, cool!
Have you been there? It's so
I've
cool.
never been to that show. I've heard a lot about it, and I'd like to go someday. But yeah, never had the opportunity.
It's really a great show. I had never been either. And it's not a juried show. Like anyone who wants to show a quilt at the Festival of Quilts can do it. And I didn't know that. So I walked in and I was like, this is the best quilt show I've ever been to, because some of the quilts were pretty rough. And I love that. I love a tied quilt. I love a quilt that's not perfect, Anyway, so I went there, and in London, I didn't have much at all in the way of sewing supplies, because we went there and I don't have a machine there or anything. So I was at this festival and I went to the vendor, like the cavernous vendor thing. It was so great. So many beautiful things to buy and notions and everything. And I realized this sounds so gross maybe, but I've never bought my own notions. Because they just were always there. And I say it sounds like such a princess thing to say.
Not at all.
It was just the way it was, right?
It is what it is, right?
Yeah, it is.
As much as I hate that saying sometimes, it is what it is.
My husband, Eric hates that saying too. I can't say it. And I'm like, oh, it would really fit in the situation, but I'm not going to say it. But yes, exactly. It was so empowering. And maybe this sounds so dumb, but it was so empowering to go to these vendors and buy notions that I liked, that I wanted, to buy thread that I wanted. And it was applique thread, just, really good all-purpose thread. I bought notions. I bought my own seam ripper. And it was so weird. I had no idea that was going to feel that way. I had no idea it mattered. But having this ownership of my quilting practice, if you will, was really powerful. And so now I'm like really selective, and like I get the best stuff that I need for that particular project or whatever. And it feels really good. So that's kind of my answer on notions. It's a strange experience that I had, but it was really cool.
That is pretty cool. And you're obviously a talented person outside of sewing, right? And probably have lots of different opportunities to do other things. But what is it about sewing that made you like, no, this is where I want to make my living. This is what I want to do.
Well, thanks for asking me that. Yeah, that's really, really important question. Quiltfolk has been my life for many years now. When I stepped down as editor, part of the reason I did that is I'm working on a documentary project about the history of quilts in America, and we're hoping to sell it to a major studio. I've got an agent in LA, all that stuff. And it's like, I want it to happen like as of 2 years ago, but this stuff takes forever, and I'm okay with that. But my interest, I do make quilts. I've almost finished my COVID quilt. It's really close. I refuse to take it into 2022. No, we are finishing this thing
That's
now.
Right.
And
let's put that to bed, okay?
Please. So it's applique, and it's really fun. So, but a couple of years ago, I don't know, more than a couple, I started to really be interested most of all in the history of quilts and the culture of quilts in America. And by that, I mean, there are quilts in fashion. There are quilts in fine art museums, obviously, not just as quilts, but used in sculpture and in painting. There are quilts, that are featured in mainstream, newspapers. There's quilts on celebrities, right? Walking down the red carpet. And I think it started when I was looking for inspiration for my next quilt. And I picked up a book of quilts from it was a book that was created for the quilt documentation projects. You remember when everybody was doing like the quilt documentation project in Kentucky and in Tennessee, right? So many of these projects made books. And so in the 90s and some into the 80s and 90s and 2000s, you have these amazing books that are now out of print. You can get them online, and they have vintage quilts, old antique quilts, right? Beautiful pictures of them, stories of the people who made them. And so I started to see that quilts were way more than pretty blankets that I liked to make. They go so deep. They tell the story of America. They tell the story of, technology. Like you can trace the history of America through quilts. In the 1930s, that green, that I don't really like that color of green that's in all those Depression era quilts,
right.
That mint green. Well, people were nuts about that color. It didn't exist before because the dye technology didn't exist to make it. And so you see the different substrates and you see the different styles of quilts over the decades. And I'm like, wait a minute. I'm interested in everything, Jason. I want to know philosophy, art, fashion, economics, history. I love it all. And that's a really hard thing to study or examine because it's just a lot of stuff.
So a lot of moving parts there to try to figure out, right?
Exactly. But if you go in through quilts, you have access to all of that. If you pick a quilt, that was made in, 1825 in Vermont, and you really look at that quilt and you investigate it and take a look, you can learn about Vermont history. You can learn about the history of quilts, in 1820. So it's so important. I'm really glad you asked me that question because I wasn't doing quilts before, I came on my mom's show and everything. I was a writer, performer in Chicago, making a living as a freelancer, making content that wasn't quilt content. But I kind of got sucked into this thing, but it's changed. It's not just about making quilts. And I got to be honest, I don't want to teach another quarter square triangle tutorial as long as I live. So now I'm doing other things, lecturing on quilt history. I debut lectures at QuiltCon every year. I did a lecture about quilts and mental health last year. I did a lecture on the AIDS quilt. And so it's I want to know the culture of this whole thing. And right now, what I'm working on that I love is a live broadcast. It's a live show on Twitch and it multi-streams to YouTube. It's called Quilt Nerd. I started it 4 months ago and I've never had more fun. It is so much fun. I share my screen. It's not Zoom, it's Twitch. And so it's a live streaming platform. And I pull together content for everybody to look at with me. And so we look at quilts and it's really fun. Actually, last night, just really quick, I have to say. So you go to twitch.tv/Yo Mary Fons.
And I was going to ask you for that address.
Thank you.
For our listeners.
And Yo Mary Fons is my Instagram handle too. And so on the show, it's about 2 hours. Sometimes we've gone 3 hours nerding out on quilts and there's a chat, obviously, and people are chatting.
So it's just like you're just hanging out with these folks, looking at quilt stuff.
That's right. Looking at quilt stuff, going down the rabbit hole. It's so cool, Jason. Awesome. It's so much fun. Oh my God. And just to give you kind of an idea, although this is the first time it happened, but a friend of mine long ago, we decided there should be a drinking game. Okay. I've never played drinking games, but we know they exist. And it's okay, we should do a drinking game that every time we read anything in the media that says, these aren't your grandmother's quilts, we do a shot. Okay. Because it's so tiresome. That line, it gets pulled out so much and we hate it so much.
That is hilarious. Yeah. How many times have I heard that?
Oh my God. And so I told the Quilt Nerd audience, which is growing really quickly. It's so awesome. And I said, if I'm going to say it now, if we ever come across that on the show, if I'm finding an article to read to you guys, or we're looking at different things and we come across it, we're going to do a shot. And I was preparing the material yesterday. I was in Walgreens, looking at this article about Beth Gutchin, and Jeffrey Gutchin, back in the 70s in the New York Times. And I was I can't wait to share this with these people. This is nerd stuff. I'm telling you, it's so much fun. But I read in this article, these aren't, your grandmother's quilts. And I was oh no. So I had to go buy a bottle of tequila and I did a shot on the show last night.
That's so fantastic.
It was really cool.
I absolutely love it.
You got to watch out.
That's pretty cool. What a neat thing. I'll have to check out Twitch. I don't even know what that is, honestly. So you just taught me something.
That's good. Video gamers use Twitch, but there's other content on Twitch, and it's just a great platform for live streaming. It was built for that. Amazon bought it years ago, so it's an Amazon property now. But it's really good.
I'm gonna check that out.
Yeah, I hope you do.
So this industry obviously full of most of the influencers in this industry are women. A lot of strong women that have made fantastic careers for themselves and just done a lot of amazing stuff. Your mom and Liz are well-known names, giants, if you will, in this industry. Who do you admire in this business? Who do you look up to? Maybe who's had, significant impact in your quilting journey and career?
Thanks for the question. It's nice to be able to say that, right? To say who I really admire. Jenny Doan was so powerful. She came on, I did a mini series thing for PBS. I think there were like 6 episodes or something called Quilt with the Stars, right? This was early on in my career. And Jenny Doan was on the Love of Quilting, the main show. Then she was there in Iowa. So, we sat down at a table. That was the format of the show. And I asked these different people about quilts and everything. And I had never met Jenny Doan. And to be honest with you, I did not know. I'm so glad I didn't know what a big deal she was, because I would have been really nervous. But I got the picture that she was this force, and we sat down at the table and I was so green. I mean, I was just like, oh God, trying so hard to not, be hated, literally be hated by like the audience, like millions of quilters in America. And Jenny and I, there's no other way to say it. And she would tell the same story. We like bonded in that conversation. We both got teary-eyed talking about something. I can't remember what it was, but we zapped. And she has just been, I just admire her so much. I am very, very proud to say that, Jenny Doan is a friend. And so she was, awesome. She was so great. And she's just kind of I just feel sort of protected by her. I think she knew how tough it was for me at the beginning. So I really appreciate her. And then, it's the historians, Barbara Brackman. I mean, we have no idea. Most people have no idea how central a figure this is in everything that we do. She wrote the Encyclopedia of Pieced Quilt Patterns, which is now in its 3rd edition. She went through and cataloged all the blocks. I mean, we have this amazing scholarship. The collectors, Rod Kirikoff is a good friend of mine. Quiltfolk just published the 2nd edition of his cult classic book, Unconventional and Unexpected, American Quilts Below the Radar. So Rod Kirikoff is this collector who's amazing. He lives in San Francisco and he collects quilts from the 1940s to the 70s-ish. So cool, polyester quilts and just amazing improvisationally pieced, a lot of them from the American South. Anyway, this book is a classic and it was out of print. And so I worked with Rod, over the past year worked with Mike and Rod to produce the 2nd edition, which is out now. And so he's somebody I admire, the people who keep quilts safe, the people who study them and work hard to keep our history alive. I admire those people too. And then people like Jenny Doan. Yeah. And so many people in the industry, Jason. I mean, it's Moda, Lisa at Moda, amazing. Just these awesome people who keep these businesses vibrant and available for us to make our work. It's so great.
I love your knowledge of all things quilting and the history and all these aspects of it. It's sometimes lost on a lot of people. They get so focused on just doing quilting, and the act of making quilts and stuff, and forget about this cool, rich history too that you seem to be so into. The
thing is, I've said to people you don't ever have to nerd out, on the history stuff. But if you look a little bit closer, it makes it even better. It's it enriches what we do, because you realize, and this is kind of a lofty thing to say, but when you make a quilt, you are part of a legacy of American quilt makers. I mean, you really are part of this amazing history. And so if you just look back a little bit at what were the quilts they were making in the 80s and why did they do that? And a lot of people forget the younger set, by which I mean, 50 and younger or younger than that, right? But we forget that women, the quilters who are in their 60s and 70s and up now, they were our age when they started. And it's we're going to be them. We're getting older every day. And so when the new quilters are starting to come up, the younger quilters, we have history to share with them. I mean, at some point, modern quilts will be vintage.
Yeah. That's just such an interesting thing to think about.
Crazy. Yeah.
That is crazy. So, obviously quilting is your thing, but is there something else, sewing, embroidery, handwork, something else that you've always wanted to sew, but you just haven't had a chance to try yet? Sort of a sewing bucket list for you?
Totally. My mom, back when we were growing up in Iowa, she had amazing cross stitch. I mean, she did really cool and framed them under glass and really great. And it was, I'm a writer and there were, alphabets on that and words and just beautiful pictorial scenes. And my favorite kind of quilts are pictorial quilts. And I like the ones that are kind of rough. If you've ever seen Well, I like it when anytime there's a quilt that has an animal embroidered, appliqued onto it, and you can't really tell if it's like a moose or a dog. Right. Yeah, like that's my favorite kind of quilt. I love it so much. And so animals and words, I really like that. And the cross stitch that my mom used to do had those elements. And so, I mean, cross stitch, like I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you.
Okay. All right. Well, we have some good products for that.
You do?
The thread. Yeah. Our 12-weight cotton. Our 12-weight cotton is perfect for cross stitch. So when you get ready to branch out, you let me know.
Listen, I will. And you know what I said with my industry contacts, it's true, Jason. I could probably be like, hey, can you hook me up with like a 12-weight cotton? But I'm not doing it. I am going to buy my own supplies. I'm serious. Well, okay. we can work it out. But it really is exciting and thrilling to have new projects,
So
and
cross stitch is Mary Fons' bucket list sewing item. I love it.
It's true.
The cool thing about cross stitch, I mean, really hand embroidery cross stitch, needle punch, all those things, the portableness of it, and the wide market possibility for those hobbies is so much different because the barrier to entry, right, is almost non-existent. I mean, you can buy a skein of floss or a spool of silky 12-weight cotton for a few bucks, and you're ready to start. A needle and some thread. That's it, and some fabric to go on.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think Hexies, when they were so popular, it's not quite as popular as it was there for a minute. You probably remember with the moderns, like the Hexie craze. But I think part of the reason that was appealing is that you could take it to the doctor's office if your kid was, going to the doctor's office. And I saw girls on the train. One time I saw 2 girls sewing Hexies on the train in Chicago. Wow. So you're right about the cross stitch is totally the same. I hadn't even thought of that. That's so true.
So see, you can spread that joy when because I guarantee you're going to love it when you start doing it, and you're like, oh my God, it's going to blow up, and you're going to be doing it all the time. So share it with everybody you know.
Well, I absolutely will. I got to find a good pattern. So.
Are you sewing anything right now?
Yep. My COVID quilt, which is a pictorial quilt, I purposely put an animal on the quilt that you can't tell what it is. It could be a cat. I mean, seriously, I cut it out by hand. Everything is cut out by hand. And it's a pictorial quilt. It says, stay safe, USA, one love, stop COVID-19. And, I can send you a picture of it. I'm really proud of it.
I'd love to see that. Yeah.
It's not good, like seriously, I love it. I love it. But part of the thing that happened when I got out of the Fons and Porter game, I realized all the quilts I used to make they were for something. They were for the show, or they were for the magazine. We were going to use them on the show to teach a certain technique. And I was super creative in my own way. And I made quilts that I love mostly. But when you can't write a pattern for the quilts that I make now. And I like it that way, and so it's just really free. And I'm really, really proud of it. And doing this kind of stuff is really my jam. And by the way, I have a sulky question. Sure. What thread would you recommend for needle turned applique? What is, because I'm kind of using what I had, and I don't know if that's the way to go.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're not a sort of traditionalist and worry about fiber types, our poly light thread is a really lightweight, 60 weight polyester is really, really good for that, and becomes really invisible when you use that product. So there you go.
I literally wrote it down. That's awesome, because I've just been using what I had. And
cool.
You
want something. You want something really light for that typically.
Right on.
So obviously quilting, sewing, but what when you're not doing those things, what other things interest you? What other hobbies, activities? What would we see on your personal Facebook page of your latest adventure doing besides sewing?
Well, London is kind of a hobby right now. My husband's job took us over there last year during a pandemic. It was very weird and stressful, but we did it, and we're all good. You can't get on a plane without tests and stuff. And so, it was still totally weird. But London is so, have you ever been to London, Jason?
I have not. In fact, the pandemic, London for me was a tragedy of this pandemic.
No.
My youngest daughter graduated high school. Actually, excuse me, it was really for my oldest daughter's graduation. My kids are only 11 months apart, but between each of their graduation years was right when the pandemic hit, right? So my oldest daughter graduated in 2020 and my youngest in 2021. So like literally between there, we had planned a big trip to Europe that was going to be for their graduation.
Sure.
So we were supposed to go to London and spend some time there, sometime in Paris and Dublin, and just it was going to be a fun trip. And that trip was a casualty of the pandemic. So no, I have not gotten to experience London yet.
Well, have you guys got plans to reboot,
Yeah, eventually. I'm hopeful that eventually, the word COVID will be ancient history. And
yes, brother. Yes.
That's not going to be something that we even have to discuss and talk about. And, but until that happens, right, it's, international travel just,
I know.
I don't know. I say that, and we went to Mexico this year, actually, for spring break. So, but anyway.
It is
your hobby.
Oh, God.
Your hobby is London. What about it? Yeah.
Well, London there's a famous quote, I can't remember who said it, but when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life. And it's like there's so much in London. Like London is a 2,000-year-old city. Like it was a Roman outpost, right? Yeah. So it is old. And like Eric and I will walk, and we learned London during the pandemic, which was really interesting because we just rode bikes all over the city. We didn't, we weren't going inside. Yeah. Even if you could, we were like, no. So we rode bikes everywhere, and there wasn't a lot of people around or cars. And so we could really kind of learn the city, which is not easy. But you walk past, you're just like walking down the street, like going to get some falafel or something. And you pass a building with a plaque on it that says built in 1607 or like, monument erected 1726, or you pass a plaque. They have all these beautiful blue plaques all over the city that say historic people like who lived there. T.S. Eliot, right there. Mozart. We had an Airbnb-ish kind of thing last year where we stayed, and Mozart spent 6 months in London, I forget what year. And there's his name, on the plaque. So like there's so much in London, and it's so old. Part of the thing about it being old that's so encouraging, if this makes sense, it's seen everything.
Right.
Like it's seen pandemics come and go. It has seen people, billions of people who have lived there, died there, made work there.
World wars.
Yes, exactly. The Blitz, like it's been through everything. And it's like, we're going to make it. We're going to make it. London is proof that like, we're going to make it. And there's something about it being so old and just like, this is the way it goes. Like time marches on. It's really comforting. We're babies, in so many ways. In so many ways, we're babies. But like the oldest building in Chicago, it's just not that old. But in London, they have
businesses and breweries and restaurants older than our country. It's amazing.
God. It is amazing. But you were saying, you haven't done the Paris, London trip. We haven't either. Because we don't, it's COVID. So like we can go to Paris later, right? When that word is not on our lips anymore. Totally the same thing. But we did go to Budapest because my mom, and my younger sister, my stepdad and my brother-in-law, they took a cruise, which I thought was kind of crazy, but they took a cruise and that was going to take them through Budapest. And so Eric and I were like, well, there's no restrictions for this and there's no restrictions for that. And like, we're super vigilant about travel. And so we did. It was the first trip we've taken outside of London. I mean, we've like driven to Birmingham and stuff. Yeah, it was so awesome. And so we really like living there. And we haven't even done the exploration of Europe that you usually would completely do. I haven't been to Paris, man. Oh man.
So are you in London right now?
I'm in Chicago now. We came home for a couple months and then we're trying to figure out what the heck we're doing. But yeah.
Cool. Well, if we make it back, we didn't make it the first time. If we actually make it back to Europe, I guess that's what I wanted to say. I've been to Europe numerous times, but if we get to London and you're there, we'll have to check you out.
Listen, really, Jason, please let me know if you go there. If at the very least, like I have really good suggestions for like neighborhoods where it's great restaurants or stuff that you just should totally do like as somebody new in the city, because I'm still very much that person. So please drop me a line if you go, and I'll just be like, hit this place, hit that neighborhood.
I will definitely take you up on that.
I hope so.
You obviously haven't listened to any of our podcasts yet. We haven't launched any, but one of the questions that I like to end with is, I've kind of always said as an industry that we're really not selling thread, notions, fabric, any of that, but sort of this feeling of accomplishment and satisfaction that comes with creating. Do you believe that? And And how would you say that thing, if you believe in it, has affected your sewing journey?
This is a great podcast, Jason. These are really good questions. They really are. I mean, it's like, that's what's the important stuff. So with my travel, as a lecturer, teacher, my travel as an editor with Quiltfolk, and now the work I'm doing with the broadcast on Twitch and just all the lecturing and all that, there is a through line, and it is that people are rewarded by, the creative process. It doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be right, whatever that is. But with a quilt, you get that with a quilt. But what you get beyond that, you get this creative process, but then you have a quilt at the end of it. So right. You can be creative. You can, you can like put together a ship thing, you can do like model cards, like you can do all this kinds of stuff, and it's creative and it's fun. You can make paintings and all. But when you make a quilt, you have all of that process enjoyment. Some people say I zen out, I get into the zone, I can forget my troubles or whatever. So you do all that. But then at the end, you have an object that can be given as a gift, that can be kept in your own home, but it's a functional object. You sleep under it. You have a picnic on it. You can hang it on the wall as art, like you have in your office. It has all of these functions. It's a very, very special piece of our material culture. People all over the world make quilts. And so you do all this stuff, and you get to pick out the thread, and you get to pick out your fabric and your pattern, or you just get to riff, and you do all that. And that's that enjoyment. But then you have the enjoyment of having a quilt in the world, and there's just nothing like it. So it's really special. And it's why I continue to do it. I make quilts for all the reasons that, we've talked about, and I make them because they ground you in a way. I believe that. So yeah, I'm a fan. I'm not going anywhere. I'm the quilt nerd that I just can't, obviously, I love to talk about this stuff. I just love it. So nerd out with me anytime.
Yeah. Well, I can't think of a better way to end, right? That was spot on right there. So, thanks for your thoughtfulness and what you're bringing to the industry. It's refreshing, and I like hearing it.
Well, Jason, it's an honor to be asked to be on one of the maiden episodes. It really is. And I appreciate it. And I'm a huge fan of Ellen March. She's another person, I've known for a while, and she's awesome. So thank you to everybody at Sulky,
Yeah, thank you for being on today. I appreciate it, and look forward to talking with you again in the future at some show, or maybe it'll be in London on a fun trip.
Heck yeah. I'm there for it.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Mary. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you for listening to Why Sew with Sulky. Give us a rating or a review, and be sure to shop your favorite Sulky products, including threads, stabilizers, kits, and more at Sulky.com.